Hi everyone, and welcome, or welcome back depending on the order you're watching the videos in, to the Suffolk Psychology and Sociology virtual conference for 2020. My name is Louise Wright and I'm a lecturer in psychology at West Suffolk College, and today I've prepared a session on adolescent risk behaviour. So this is a brief summary of what we're going to cover in the session today. I'll start off by clarifying some definitions of some important terms, just so that we're all on the same page for the rest of the session. Then we'll begin looking at the topic of adolescent risk behaviour more specifically, by exploring why people are interested in studying adolescent risk behaviour. After that, we'll begin to discover some of the research and theory concerning why adolescents might take part in risk behaviour. And finally, we'll briefly look at how the research and theory that we discussed earlier in the session has been used in designing interventions that aim to reduce adolescent risk behaviour. So the first term that I want to define is risk behaviour itself, because there are actually several different definitions of risk behaviour depending on the underlying views of the researcher or the academic that's put it forward. So for the purposes of this session today, I'm going to use the definition of Moore and Galone. So they defined risk behaviour as behaviour that involves potential negative consequences or loss, but balanced in some way by perceived positive consequences or gain. So the important things to take from this definition are firstly that risk behaviour has both positive and negative consequences, or good and bad things that could happen because of doing the behaviour. And secondly, that the consequences of the behaviour are not set in stone. They're just things that the person is aware could happen, but they don't actually know for certain what will happen. So when I talk about adolescent risk behaviour, what I mean are things like binge drinking, having underage sex or smoking cigarettes. As an example of how this definition applies to that, these adolescent risk behaviours that I've mentioned are all things that put the health or well-being of the person at risk, which would be the negative consequence that could happen. But there are also some things that could happen as a result of doing them that the person could see as positive. So, for example, fitting in with their friends could be a potential positive consequence that they're hoping to get. The second term that I want to define, just so that we're all on the same page again, is adolescence, because there is some discussion about the age range that we should consider to be adolescents. So I'll be using the World Health Organization definition, which is that adolescence is the phase of life between childhood and adulthood from ages 10 to 19. So although we perhaps often think of an adult being an 18-year-old, the World Health Organization would actually consider that you're still in adolescence at 18. So from now on, when I say adolescent, I'm referring to someone between the age of 10 to 19 years. So now that we have those definitions out of the way, we can move on to beginning to look at adolescent risk behaviour specifically. Now, the concept of adolescent risk behaviour is debated by some, but unfortunately I don't have the time to get into that discussion today. So instead, I really want to focus on why we're even interested in studying adolescent risk behaviour in the first place. A key part of this puzzle is what some people refer to as a health paradox. And what we mean by health paradox is that adolescence is actually, in a lot of ways, the healthiest part of a person's life. They're often the least likely to suffer from serious illness, and they're generally very fit and healthy. And yet, as this World Health Organization statistic states, over 3,000 adolescents die every day from preventable or treatable causes. So although adolescence should be one of the healthiest times in a person's life, they actually also have one of the highest mortality rates in comparison to other age groups. And one of the most likely causes of death in adolescence is injury. So for example, from a road traffic accident. And lots of the risk behaviours adolescents might take part in can also impact how healthy they are in the future. So the hope is that by understanding adolescent risk behaviour better, we might be able to protect them, and then by doing that, we're ensuring that they go on to live, hopefully, long and healthy lives. I think the World Health Organization infographic that I've included here on this slide actually sums up why we're interested in adolescent risk behaviour quite nicely, because it illustrates that the more healthy adolescents we have now, the more healthy adults we then have in the future, and they can pass on their good habits to future generations so that everyone benefits in the long run. Now you hopefully understand why people are interested in understanding and preventing adolescent risk behaviour. And a key part of preventing adolescent risk behaviour is what we're going to talk about next, which is searching for the why. So trying to understand why adolescents are more likely to engage in risk behaviour than other age groups, or why some adolescents take part in risk behaviours that others don't. So researchers have focused on exploring the link between adolescent risk behaviour and other factors like psychology or biology, and we're going to move on in this session to looking at some of this research. So the first set of factors we're going to look at are psychological factors, beginning with research findings related to personality. So as you can see on the slide here, personality traits or states like being high sensation seeking or needing a lot of stimulation, having low self-esteem or not thinking very highly of yourself, being impulsive, so not thinking things through before doing them, and egocentrism or being very focused on yourself and not others. These are all things that have been linked to increased risk taking in adolescence. However, this research is definitely not as clear-cut as we would perhaps like, and there can be as many studies saying an aspect of personality is linked to risk behaviour as there are studies saying that the same aspect of personality isn't linked to risk behaviour. There are just so many aspects of personality to explore, and people measure them in different ways. So for example, some researchers found that we have different levels of self-esteem in different parts of our lives, and each of those different aspects of self-esteem are linked to risk behaviour in different ways. And not only can there be differences in how we measure personality states or traits, but we also have to consider the differences between people that might influence how their personality relates to risk behaviour. So for example, some research has found that low self-esteem was linked to more risk behaviour, but only in boys, not in girls. So we're definitely closer to understanding how personality might be linked to adolescent risk behaviour, but there are some important issues to consider with that research as well. The next psychological factor that I want to look at is mental health. Most research so far has looked at depression or anxiety because they are common mental health disorders in both adults and young people. And a link has been found between depressive symptoms and risk behaviours like smoking or missing school. So the more symptoms of depression the young person reported in these studies, the more likely they were to also report taking part in risk behaviour. And there's an interesting hypothesis that perhaps adolescents used risk behaviours as a way of coping with their emotions or their symptoms of mental illness. So perhaps they drink to numb their sadness or reduce their feeling of anxiety in social situations. And there is some evidence supportive of this hypothesis, particularly in relation to the use of marijuana and other drugs, as well as smoking. However, it doesn't seem to always be the case that mental health symptoms are related to increased risk behaviour, as there are some studies which have found that symptoms of social anxiety were associated with less risk-taking behaviour, perhaps because people with social anxiety are less likely to socialise in groups, or they're more concerned about people thinking badly of them, or they consider the negative consequences of a risk behaviour more than other groups. As well as an individual's personality and psychological well-being or mental health, researchers have considered another psychological factor, and that is our cognitive processes or the way that we think. And particularly here we're going to look at how the way in which people make decisions is linked to adolescent risk behaviour. So in 1990, Furby and Bathmaram conducted a review of the literature about decision making, and as a result of that review they described 5 aspects of making a decision that they thought, based on the evidence they'd seen, could differ between adults and adolescents, and so could possibly explain why the levels of risk behaviour differ between the age groups as well. So they thought the first step in making a decision is identifying the available options. So basically, in order to do a risk behaviour, or not do a risk behaviour, sorry, we also have to know that there is an option not to. If we think our only option is the risk behaviour, then of course we're only going to do that because we don't know that there's an option not to. The second step is identifying the potential consequences of each option. So if we know that we have more than one option, so doing the behaviour or not doing the behaviour, then we next need to be able to think about the good and bad things that might happen first if we do the risk behaviour, and then if we don't do the risk behaviour. So if we're not able to think of any bad things about doing a risk behaviour, then why wouldn't we do it? Next, we have to think about which of the consequences of the behaviours is most important to us. So, for example, we might know that smoking could give us lung disease, but actually in that moment, the potential consequence of smoking that is most important to us is fitting in with our friends. The third step is figuring out how likely each of the consequences we've thought about actually is. So, for example, if we think that the chance of a behaviour causing us harm is very small, then we might choose to take that risk. And the final step in making the decision is putting everything that I've just talked about together to fit with what researchers call a decision rule. So a decision rule could be, for example, I will pick the option with the most positive consequences. So the idea is that when adolescents and adults make decisions, they might come to different conclusions at any of these 5 points we've just discussed. And that might be why adolescents are more likely to take risks than adults are. But unfortunately, again, there is mixed research about this, and also a lack of research that actually directly compares adults to adolescents. It's definitely difficult to measure some aspects of decision making because we often can't. We can only ask people to explain to us how they made their decision, and they might actually not even be aware themselves of how they made that decision or what influenced them to make that decision. The next set of factors that we're going to consider are social and environmental factors. So we're moving on from psychological factors to explore social or environmental factors. And it may not come as a surprise that the first thing we're going to look at is actually peers or friends. So being around peers or friends has been found to increase risk behaviour of adolescents, and this probably won't come as a surprise to most of you. I think most of us are aware of the concept of peer pressure and how that can play a role in the way that people behave, but it definitely doesn't seem to be the case that just being around friends automatically makes adolescents take more risks. It looks like the attitudes or behaviour of their peers is very important. So if an adolescent has friends that take risks, then perhaps they are more likely to also take risks themselves. But actually, if they have a group of friends who don't take many risks, then they are also less likely to take risks. So it's about wanting to fit in with whatever the attitude or behaviour of their peers is. There's also some evidence that the impact of peers on risk behaviour can be influenced by other types of support that adolescents have in their lives. So, for example, if their family or their teachers are particularly supportive, then they are less likely to take risks, even if they do have a particularly risky group of friends. Now, peers or friends are definitely not the only social aspect of a young person's life. They're also influenced by their family. So, for example, their parents or their carers. It perhaps will come as no surprise that adolescents have been found to imitate what their parents do. So if their parents smoke, then the adolescents are also more likely to smoke. But it isn't just the risk behaviours that parents or carers themselves do that makes family important to adolescent risk behaviour. It's also things like the structure of the family. For example, those adolescents from single parent families have been found to be more likely to engage in risk behaviour, as have those adolescents who come from families where there is a lot of conflict or disagreement or arguing. It's thought that this could be because if parents are busy dealing with all that conflict, disagreement, arguing, then they obviously have less time perhaps to monitor or supervise any adolescents in their family. And parents or carers have a specific role to play in reducing adolescent risk behaviour because they can provide that supervision and monitoring that makes it harder for adolescents to take risks. So, for example, a parent could give an adolescent a curfew and ask that they not go to certain parts of town or spend time with certain people, and that could reduce the opportunity for them to take part in risk behaviour. However, although we might think that actually more monitoring and more supervision would only reduce adolescent risk behaviour, there is actually evidence that it can backfire, particularly if the parenting style is quite authoritarian or strict, as this can just make adolescents want to rebel against the rules, which I'm sure is an idea that we're all familiar with. The third social or environmental factor that I want to look at is school. So during term time, adolescents probably spend more time at school than they do at home, or at least in the time that they're awake anyway. So it's important to consider how school can influence their behaviour too. Doing badly at school academically is associated with increased risk behaviour, but lots of research has actually focused on measuring how connected adolescents feel to their school. for example, by asking them about how supported they feel, how safe they feel at school, and whether they feel valued. And those feelings of feeling connected to school have consistently been shown to be linked with reduced risk behaviour. So the more connected to an adolescent feels to school, the less likely they are to report taking part in risk behaviours. And the socioeconomic status or wealth or affluence of a school has also been shown to be relevant to adolescent risk behaviour. So the wealthier their school was, the less likely risk behaviour was. The final social or environmental factor that I want to touch on is the media, which I think we could argue is a more prominent feature in the lives of adolescents now than it was for adolescents in the past. So when I say media, that could be television, the internet, social media, magazines, all those sorts of things. Now, although as with all of this research, we of course can't make causal assumptions or say doing this thing or seeing this thing causes more risk behaviour, there is research evidence that shows that, for example, seeing advertising for alcohol is associated with drinking behaviour in adolescents, and similarly, seeing sexual content in the media is linked to engaging in sexual behaviour at a younger age. And there have also been several reviews of the literature, which is where someone looks at all of the available evidence for a topic and they summarise it and they make a conclusion from it. And these reviews have found that actually seeing violence in the media is linked to higher rates of aggression or violence in adolescents. So exposure to media is definitely something that needs to be considered when it comes to adolescent risk behaviour. The final set of factors that I want to explore in this session are biological factors related to risk behaviour. Now, the concept that I'm going to spend the most time on here is that of the adolescent brain. So there is some argument that perhaps adolescent brains are fundamentally different to adult brains, and that is why adolescents engage in more risk behaviour than adults do. And there definitely are some differences between adult and adolescent brains in terms of the amount of white and grey matter, as well as the number of connections between different areas. We get more of these things as we age, up to a point anyway. And several theorists, particularly a researcher called Steinberg and his team, have proposed that the areas of the brain associated with controlling our behaviour and stopping ourselves doing things actually develop slower than the areas of the brain that process our emotions and other social influences. So the idea here is that perhaps risk behaviour happens because when we're young, that part of the brain that controls our impulses and helps us make decisions and weigh up options and consequences isn't fully developed, so we just go with our gut, or we're driven by our emotions or what our friends are doing. But as we get older, we are less likely to take risks because that part of our brain that controls our impulses and helps us make decisions has caught up with the part that processes our emotions and social influences, so we're better able to stop ourselves and think things through properly before we do them. But again, this research is really interesting, but there are difficulties with brain studies because of issues like their tendency to use small samples. Other biological factors that have been explored in relation to adolescent risk behaviour are genes and hormones. For example, researchers have looked at whether the changes in our hormones at puberty play a role in our levels of risk behaviour. So we've looked at some of the research about different factors that might influence adolescent risk behaviour, and now we're going to move on to exploring how these factors have been combined by researchers into theories about how adolescent risk behaviour actually develops. An important point to note here is that these factors are often referred to as risk factors or protective factors. So risk factors are those things which seem to increase the chances of adolescent risk behaviour, and it's generally agreed that the more risk factors a person experiences, the more likely a negative outcome is. However, when researchers were looking at risk factors, they found cases of people who had a lot of risk factors in their lives but still seemed to do really well, and that's where the idea of protective factors came in. So protective factors are those which seem to reduce the impact of risk factors, so they help risk factors have less influence on a person. So for an example, as we saw in the research before, people with supportive families may not engage in risk behaviour even if they have a group of risky friends. And that's an example of a protective factor, like having a supportive family, reducing the impact of a risk factor like having a group of risky friends. Hopefully, over the course of the session so far, it's become clear that lots of different things can influence adolescent risk behaviour in different ways, and so trying to combine them in a theory can be a really useful way of trying to put all of the information together in a way that makes sense. There are lots and lots of different theories about adolescent risk behaviour, so I'm going to talk about just two here, and they are problem behaviour theory by Jesser and Jesser and the social development model by Catalano and Hawkins. The first theory I want to talk about is problem behaviour theory by Jesser and Jesser. Now, I apologise for the size of the diagrams in the next couple of slides. It was really difficult to fit into a PowerPoint slide, but I'll be talking through the theories anyway. So hopefully, if you can't see everything clearly, then you'll still be able to understand what the theories are all about. Now, problem behaviour theory tries to combine biological, social or environmental and personality factors to explain how risk behaviour develops. And this theory proposes that there are 5 different domains or groups of risk and protective factors: biology or genetics, social environment, perceived environment, personality and behaviour. And these are all shown in the top line of the diagram. So for biology or genetics, the examples included here, for example, risk factors, family history of alcoholism, and protective factors listed are high intelligence. For perceived environment, which is the second box in the top line of the diagram, risk factors listed include poverty and racial inequality, and protective factors include quality schools and a cohesive family. So they're both things that we talked about earlier in the session when we discussed the impact of school socioeconomic status and school connectedness on risk behaviour, and we also talked about family cohesiveness in the sense of how family structure impacts risk behaviour, and how being part of a family in which conflict is quite common may also increase the likelihood that you'll engage in risk behaviour as an adolescent. So for social environment, risk factors listed include models for deviant behaviour. So we talked about that earlier in the session when we touched on adolescents imitating the risk behaviours that they see their parents taking part in. Protective factors examples include high controls against deviant behaviour. So again, that basically just means what we discussed earlier about how parents can have quite a significant impact on adolescent risk behaviour, because they are able, in theory, to put in place boundaries and enforce curfews and things like that to try and reduce the opportunities for adolescents to take part in risk behaviour. Moving on to personality, risk factors listed here probably come as no surprise given what we've discussed earlier, but actually low self-esteem is listed as a risk factor here. And protective factors, the examples given are valuing achievement, valuing health, and not being very tolerant of deviance. And the last box on that top row is behaviour, and the risk factors listed here are problem drinking. The protective factors include things like church attendance, involvement in extracurricular activities at school or other sort of voluntary clubs and organisations. They're considered to be protective factors. So the behaviour section here is actually really interesting, because Jesser and their colleagues theorise that engaging in one particular risk behaviour, so the example that they've given here is problem drinking in that box, so they theorise that engaging in one particular risk behaviour is in itself a risk factor for engaging in other risk behaviours. So if you smoke, for example, you're also more likely to drink alcohol. And this theory proposes that it is the amount of risk or protective factors across all of these domains, so biology or genetics, perceived environment, social environment, personality and behaviour, that determines whether an adolescent is more or less likely to engage in risk behaviour. And that's denoted by the arrows that you can hopefully possibly see on the diagram between each of the domains, and then the second box or the second level on the diagram denotes some risk behaviours. So it's got problem behaviours, health related behaviours, and school behaviours listed there, things like delinquency, drink driving, truancy. So those with a high number of risk factors and less protective factors would be considered more likely to engage in risk behaviour than those with a high number of risk factors but also a high number of protective factors. And just in case you really cannot see the diagram, the bottom box is actually some examples of risk outcomes, so the negative or positive consequences of risk behaviours. So hopefully, if you can't see the diagram, that brief explanation will give you some idea of what it denotes. So just to go over it quickly again, there's the 5 risk and protective factor domains at the top, which feed into the risk behaviours, and the risk behaviours then feed in to the risk outcomes. So the concepts proposed within problem behaviour theory have been found by the authors and their colleagues to be applicable to quite a wide range of behaviours, including things like drinking alcohol and using contraceptives during sexual activity. But the idea that different risk behaviours are linked together, so that if an adolescent engages in one risk behaviour, they're more likely to engage in another different risk behaviour, has been met with some disagreement. The second theory I want to talk a little bit about is the social development model by Catalano and Hawkins. Now, this diagram is a little bit more visible, at least on my screen, so hopefully you won't have as much of a problem with this diagram as with the one on the previous slide. And unlike problem behaviour theory that we talked about a second ago, the social development model doesn't make the same statement about risk behaviour in itself being a risk factor for engaging in more risk behaviour. Ultimately, what the social development model theorises is that young people learn how to behave from the groups and the organisations or societies with which they have contact. So to put it in very simple terms, if those groups are antisocial, they will also become antisocial, and if those groups are pro-social, then the adolescent will also become pro-social. So just in case you are having any difficulties seeing the diagram, because it is still fairly small, I'll talk you just very briefly through the main concepts that it shows. So it moves from the left hand side of the screen to the right, and there is a pro-social path, or what they call a pro-social path, at the top, and an anti-social path at the bottom. So generally, an adolescent is considered to either be moving along the pro-social path or the antisocial path. And on the far left, there are things like external constraints, so that would be your family standards, social norms. In the next box down are things that denote position in the social structure, so that would be things like socioeconomic status or age or gender. And then the box at the very bottom there says individual constitutional factors, so they're things like your personality, your intelligence, those things that are very specific to you. And then those things feed into whether you not necessarily choose, but whether you end up going down a pro-social or an anti-social path. And essentially each path has opportunities, involvement, rewards, bonding to the others, and then belief in those values, whether they be pro-social or anti-social. And the idea is that if you go down the antisocial path, then you're more likely to be involved in delinquency and other problem behaviours, which is what the rectangle in the middle of the diagram on the far right says. But if you're on a pro-social path, then you're less likely to take part in delinquency and other problem behaviours, or what we might now call risk behaviours. So it's all about the opportunities and the bonding and how much you believe in what you're being told by those organisations, those groups that you are socialising with, and how much you want to fit in with them. And if they're a positive influence in your life, then the chances are that actually you'll be less likely to take part in risk behaviour. But if the group in themselves is negative, or they particularly believe in antisocial things which could involve risk behaviour, then actually you're more likely to want to align yourselves with them and also engage in those behaviours and have those attitudes. So I've given you a brief taster of some of the theories about how adolescent risk behaviour might develop. And what makes theories like those really useful is that they actually allow us to think about how we could create interventions that try to manipulate the risk or protective factors present in an adolescent's life in order to reduce the chance of risk behaviour. So we might try to increase someone's self-esteem, for example, or improve how connected they feel to school in the hope that that would in turn reduce their risk behaviour. And in 2013, the Department for Education actually published a report that reviewed the literature about interventions that tried to reduce risk behaviour and provided some ideas for the things that have worked best so far. Now, one type of intervention used a lot in the past, although it's still used now, is something called the information deficit approach. So this relies on the idea that adolescents do risky things because they just don't know what the consequences are or how bad they could be. So if we tell them about all the bad things that could happen, then surely they just won't do it. But this review found that actually, although this sort of intervention might improve the adolescent's knowledge of consequences, that doesn't often translate over to their behaviour. So their knowledge improves, but their behaviour doesn't really change. Now, other people have used what is called a social norms approach. So this approach relies on the idea that young people do risky things because they don't understand that actually their peers aren't doing those things either, even if they say they are. So the idea is that if we help young people to correct this perception, then they'll feel less pressured to do risky things. But again, the problem here seems to be that these social norms interventions might help young people to correct their beliefs about what their peers are up to, but that doesn't actually lead to a change in behaviour. And ultimately, the research seems to suggest that tackling adolescent risk behaviour requires lots of different approaches, different interventions at different times that focus on different risk and protective factors, because there are just so many risk and protective factors that could play a role in an adolescent's behaviour, and each adolescent is ultimately unique. Okay, so that's the end of the session that I prepared and the time that I have. So in summary, today we started off by making sure that some key terms were clearly defined. So that was risk, behaviour and adolescence. And then we explored why people are interested in studying risk behaviour. So we covered the health paradox. And then we looked at some of the research and theories that seek to explain why adolescents might do risky things. And this covered psychological, social or environmental and biological factors and how they are linked to risk behaviour. And then to end the session, we briefly looked at how those factors have been combined into theories. So we looked at problem behaviour theory from Jesser and Jesser, and we also looked at the social development model from Catalano and Hawkins, and how they combined risk and protective factors in an attempt to explain how adolescent risk behaviour develops. And then to end the session, we actually briefly looked at how the research and the theory that we discussed earlier in the session has been used in designing interventions that aim to reduce adolescent risk behaviour. So that's it. I have several slides of references here that will play through as this video continues. I apologise, they're all in the order that I use them in the slides rather than listed alphabetically, but if there are any particular references I've included that you'd like more details on, or any questions that you have about what I've talked about today, please do feel free to drop me an email. I believe the email addresses of all of the speakers at the conference today are being shared with you. And please do also feel free to contact me if you're interested in studying psychology or sociology with us at West Suffolk College and want to find out a little more about what we can offer you. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much for listening.